Awesome. And am live. So, I'm going to preface this discussion. A couple subscribers have reached out to me about this topic, especially Mr. John Laughs. Mr. John Laughs, I've been seeing your messages and definitely think that this is worth a video, so here it is. It's been said of circumcision that it is a treatment in search of a cure, that it's a medical procedure that has been searching for rationalization ever since it became popularized. And there's actually an interesting sociological phenomenon here where whatever the disease of the decade is, somebody will try and show that circumcision will protect against that. So this hasn't always been the case, because for most of its history, circumcision was not a medical procedure. It's not something that you would do or think about doing or consider doing for any kind of medical benefit. There are people today who look back at, say, the tradition of the rite in Jewish culture as a ritual, and they try and say, "Oh, this is some kind of prophylactic," or that there's this kind of movement. It's not just with circumcisions, with a couple things where people try and go back and find wisdom in traditions. And sometimes there might be some merit to that, sometimes not. But this is a case where it's clearly not. There's no evidence that the covenant with God, as Jews saw it, or as the other societies that practiced as Jews were just one of the societies that did so because they thought it conferred any kind of medical benefit. They never claimed that. They never acted like that. And indeed, there were later Jewish thinkers who were quite explicit that it was not something that was beneficial, that it was done as a sacrifice to show your devotion to God. I was going to go ahead and put a link to the study here so people can see. I'll be talking about it, though, so people can see it there. But, if you believe that God has commanded you to do it, then you don't need a medical rationalization. You don't need to think of a reason why it's good. And so they didn't. And then in the late 18th century, there started to be physicians, which, even the position of a physician, the idea of a doctor was something that was gradually developing. And some of them started to say that circumcision would have some kind of medical benefit. And one of the first diseases that they were worried about was something called spermatorrhea. Now, if you've never heard of spermatorrhea, it's for a good reason, because it's not a real disease. It's a made-up disease. But there was a widespread belief that seminal loss of semen through anything other than procreation with your wife was harmful. So nocturnal emissions, masturbating, and that this disease, so-called spermatorrhea, caused all kinds of problems, insanity, made people less masculine, like all kinds of stuff. And it was purported that circumcision would be a treatment or a cure for that. Then later, for syphilis, chlamydia, gonorrhea, in the early 1900s, and it really, it was the late 1800s, or the late 18th century, I should say, where these ideas first started to get kind of talked about, especially in France and then in the UK. It wasn't until the second half of the 19th century that this started to actually be done, and it started to become more popular. So a good metric here is the Encyclopedia Britannica. Its entry in 1860 lists circumcision as just a religious rite practice among Jews and Muslims. The Encyclopedia Britannica 1870 says that it's that, and then also adds that it's a medical procedure for certain things, right? And so that's when we have the growth, gradually at first, and then much more rapidly after the 20th century, of medicalized circumcision, and that medicalized practice could not rely on the Bible and say, well, we're doing this because of Genesis, or because God commanded it, or it's a tradition. They had to have some kind of medical justification for doing it. Now, I think it's important to point here, I think initially this was genuinely believed. I think that the doctors who were pushing this in the second half of the 19th century really did believe that this was a cure for certain things. There are theories out there, I have to say unsubstantiated and probably not likely, that Jews are behind all this, and that the Jews, I mean, obviously Jews believe in circumcision and Jews were circumcising. I don't think that there's any evidence that they tried to push this on Gentiles. It would eliminate their distinctiveness in a lot of ways. Now, maybe that could be considered a strategy, but there is yet to be, and I've looked, there's no evidence that that's the case. Now, is it possible? There does seem to be some evidence that the initial Gentile surgeons who were interested in circumcision did use Jews as an inspiration. They said, okay, well, this is a procedure that we think would be beneficial for various reasons. And who knows about circumcision? Well, Jews know about circumcision. So it became where they looked. And it seems likely that the style of circumcision that was adopted was the one that was at that time practiced by Jews. Now, of course, Jews have not practiced the same type of circumcision throughout their entire history. Up until Roman times, a much more mild form of circumcision was practiced. So there's an interesting and enlightening debate on this very topic on the statue of David, because the statue of David, a famous Jew, one of the most famous, if not the most famous king of the Jews, and Michelangelo's iconic, most famous statue ever, appears to be uncircumcised. Now, this could simply be that Michelangelo was using, male models of Italy in the 15th century, and they were uncircumcised, and so that's what he sculpted. But there's also the argument that the original form of circumcision that the Jews practiced was a much more mild type, where they would only take the acropostion. For those of you who don't know what the acropostion is, if you're cut, it might be hard to imagine. If you're uncut, you may be able to envision this, but it's the bit of skin that overhangs the glans penis, the overhang, the anteater, the snout. It has other names. There aren't too many names in American English because it's not something that American English has had to deal with very much in the last 100 years, but there it is. And that would basically leave the head still covered, which is not good, but it's mild compared to what was later done. However, you ended up getting in the Hellenistic period, when Palestine had been ruled by the Greeks and then by the Romans, although still very much in a Hellenistic kind of culture, many Jews basically restored their foreskins to look more uncircumcised, or to compete in as a sign of their Hellenization and of their kind of a physical manifestation of their rejecting of their Jewish culture. And there was a rabbinical backlash against this, and so a much more extreme type of circumcision was created, where all of the skin would be removed, all the prepuce, so to speak, so leaving the glands completely uncovered, which is not the original type. So, I mean, to go to the Michelangelo, I have no idea if Michelangelo, I believe, did do a lot of research into his artwork. A lot of those Renaissance artists did. I don't know if he knew about that or not, or if he was just going off of his models. I don't know. It's an interesting debate either way. But this rabbinical backlash created the complete removal of the prepuce. It made restoration much more difficult, although it's still completely possible. Foreskin restoration actually has a surprisingly long history. We even have examples of the devices they used. The Romans called them, I forget the Latin term, but they called them Jew stones. There were more than one type. The Greeks did it as well. The Greeks did not practice circumcision, but it was considered lewd to have nudity in ancient Greece was pretty common, actually, and almost expected in things like a gymnasium. But you did not want your glands exposed. That was considered lewd or sexual. So going around with your foreskin over your penis head, that was fine, no big deal there. But if your head popped out, well, that just shows that you were, a horny bitch. So some men, though, naturally, even if they're not circumcised, have shorter foreskins, and their heads are partially and sometimes almost entirely exposed. I mean, I know uncircumcised guys whose heads are almost completely exposed all the time. so what the Greeks would do is they had it's called a ketesema, but it's like a belt you would wear and then tie a little knot over the foreskin. Jews tended to use what they called Jew stones, like a little dumbbell that you would wrap the skin around. Anyway, so in the 19th century, where these British and American surgeons decided that circumcision was going to be in some places they saw it as prophylactic, and others they saw it as a treatment. So there was a revolution in the 1830s and 40s in general healthcare, just realizing two things: that antiseptic and sanitation made surgery a lot more safe. So people prior to that, if you had surgery at all for even a very minor surgery, they're going to cut you open with just a regular knife, and you're going to get infected. They realized that if you sanitize the blades, that you could have surgery and it was much safer. They also realized that getting rid of filth and garbage in cities lowered disease rates. They didn't know that germs caused disease, but they knew if they got rid of the trash and the manure and the excrement and had better plumbing and better sewers and got rid of the spittoons, that the incidences of many types of diseases would go down. And so it became this idea that you had to get rid of grime and dirt and whatnot. And for many people, they said, well, the foreskin is some kind of magnet, or it's a place where grime and material can build up. That is not completely false, although there's many parts of your body where that's possible, and we don't go cutting them off. It's also not so applicable in today's modern days where we have plumbing and whatnot. But so this idea that it's a cure for things like, some people thought it would cure you of masturbation, some people thought it would cure you of homosexuality, of insanity, and there were also arguments, puritanical ones, anti-sexual ones, that foreskins are actually really pleasurable. They feel really good. This is something Maimonides talked about, that uncircumcised penises were superior both for the male and for the female, and that Jewish women should not be allowed to have sex with Gentile men, because if they would prefer it too much and they would never want to meet or have sex with Jewish men. Also, it was good for Jewish men because then sex would not be as pleasurable, and then they could focus on more important things like studying Torah. So that's it's interesting too. I saw a great debate with Christopher Hitchens where he started quoting Maimonides on this, and the rabbi he was debating is like, well, it's Maimonides, I wouldn't, who cares what he thinks? And Hitchens was like, well, you certainly care what Maimonides said about everything else, so why are you ignoring him on this? But what ended up happening though is circumcision isn't a treatment for any of those diseases. Some of the things are not actually diseases, right? Spermatorrhea is not a disease, and then whatever became the popular the disease of the decade, people started saying circumcision would cure that. So cancer, UTIs, syphilis, because syphilis was a huge scourge of the 19th century, chlamydia, gonorrhea, and then starting in the 90s, and then especially in the 2000s, HIV. Now, as soon as HIV and AIDS sprung on the scene in the 1980s, there were doctors immediately who said circumcision would help prevent that. This was especially weird because that early they weren't even sure how it was transmitted. But these claims literally had no basis. But the advocates of circumcision are always trying to find a way to rationalize it. And here's the broader point. I think these first doctors, they weren't modern. They didn't know modern medicine. They didn't even know the germ theory of disease. But I can forgive them. It's understandable in their ignorance that they would make a wrong choice. And you can almost imagine, and I've talked about this in my other videos on the history of circumcision, you can almost imagine a doctor in the 1860s or 70s who, is conscientious and wants to help his patient, and he has sick people coming in all the time. He's got sick men coming in all the time. And really, there was very little that they could do. They didn't have, quinine had been developed, so if you had malaria, they might be able to help you there. They had vaccines for things like smallpox, but that's obviously not something you can give after somebody's sick. And then for any kind of infection, they didn't know what caused it, and they didn't have really any way to cure it. There were no antibiotics. There were no antiviral drugs. But after the 1830s and 40s, they realized that they could do surgery. So surgery became kind of the only cure-all thing that they could do for everything. And the other thing is, you could certainly imagine, you have all these men coming in and they're all sick with different things, and you ask them questions like, have you been sleeping? Have you been eating? And if you were to ask them, do you masturbate? I don't know what phrases they would have used, but the answer was going to always be yes. You could say, oh, look, all the sick people who come into my clinic are masturbating. Must be that masturbation causes problems, right? So I can forgive it's just like, they had ignorance they didn't understand. So these first doctors, I think, honestly, thought maybe circumcision is a cure for some of these ailments. And so they started doing it. One of the problems, though, it was very difficult to convince adult men to get circumcised. It's very, very difficult. If you have an adult man who presumably has been masturbating and has been having sex, he more than likely is going to associate his foreskin with pleasure and part of his sexual identity and part of who he is, and it's not going to be easy to convince him to cut it off, especially in pre-modern times, right, without anesthetic and with a much more risky surgery. But it turned out that it was a lot more possible to persuade them to have it done to their children. Now, in the UK, this was not usually done to neonates. This was usually done to slightly older children, 5 to 12, something like that. And, those children can't legally resist, but they can be upset with it. And when they grow up, they may resent what happened to them. And there's a very famous case of this with John Maynard Keynes, actually. John Maynard Keynes was forcibly circumcised around the age of 8 or 9 by his father for masturbating too much. We have a lot of details on this because Keynes's brother, who gave details about this story when he was himself in his 90s, talked about it. Keynes would apparently play with himself through his pockets. He put his hands in his pockets and play with his dick, and his dad didn't like that, and he had his pockets sewn shut, and the problem persisted, and so he had him circumcised, and apparently Keynes was upset about it, and he gave us horrible economics as a result. So, if we're looking at the negative externalities of circumcision, there's a big one right there. But in the United States, it became the norm to do it to neonates, to do it people very early. And I don't know if this was influenced by the Jewish practice, which is to do it on the 8th day. I'm not sure about that. Not necessarily. It could, but it does seem that the Jewish style of circumcision is what surgeons turn to. Now, there were some surgeons who did not agree with that, because most of the things that they said it was good for, most of the reasons why they said it was necessary to clean under the, with so-called clean under the hood, there's this idea that if you need to be able to retract the foreskin to clean under there, this is true with an adult, this is not true with a child. In children, the vast majority of children anyway, the foreskin is fused to the glands by a membrane. This membrane only very, very gradually dissolves in some cases. I think the mean age is 10, which means it's not uncommon for it to still be there when somebody is 15, 16, 17, 18. It's only then that you start to ask that maybe there's an issue. There might be a phimosis diagnosis once they get to 18, but not before. But many of these doctors at the turn of the 20th century were saying that it needed to be retracted. Now, there were doctors, surgeons, who said, well, to do that, all we need to do is basically the old school circumcision and remove the overhang, the so-called acropostion, and not the entire prepuce. But that side of the debate apparently never really got traction and never became popularized. So we ended up with the much more invasive, much more serious, much more involved, much more destructive, full removal of the prepuce. But again, I think that the doctors who popularized this, yes, they were wrong by our standards. They didn't know what they were talking about. They didn't understand the germ theory of medicine. They didn't really understand empiricism as we would. And so, I'm not going to castigate these people as horrible monsters. But what's interesting then is now you start to have a larger and larger percentage of baby boys who are circumcised at birth. And the inflection point in the United States, the rates started to go up a lot once hospitals became the norm for childbirth, right? So as long as children were being born at home, by and large, very few of them were getting circumcised. When more of them were getting born in hospitals, this is becoming more common. And there could be fiduciary reasons for this. It's one more thing to charge for. but it became more and more popular. Around 1920, it passed the 50%. And at some point by World War II, or maybe in the 50s, it got very high, probably in the 90+%. So what's interesting then is now you have entire generations of men essentially who never have no memory of ever being uncircumcised. They're not like John Maynard Keynes. They don't remember getting cut when they were 10 or 12 or anything like that. And they grow up and some of them become doctors. And then those doctors have basically zero appreciation of foreskin. It's not something that they personally have any experience with. They were themselves circumcised, and this becomes a mimetic cultural trait then. But they're not doing it for religious reasons for the most part. So, again, exceptions here for Jews and Muslims. So what do? Well, you have to have a justification, right? You're doing a surgery. It's a serious business. Even if it's a minor surgery and a common one, it's still a serious thing to do. So they needed a justification, or more aptly said, a rationalization. And finding some kind of disease or treatment became the norm. Now, this is never a treatment. If you're doing it to all neonates, then you're not doing it as a treatment for disease. You're not assuming that they're all going to have phimosis or that they're going to have UTIs, which of course it wouldn't. If you had a UTI, it wouldn't protect you from it. So again, they were looking for prophylactic causes, things that it's going to protect you from. UTIs, STDs, especially syphilis, gonorrhea, chlamydia, cancer. And as soon as the HIV crisis came about in the 80s, you were a doctor saying, well, maybe circumcision will help with that. But of course, by then, it's already been done to everyone. And one of the things that should have been asked by anyone who was serious about that, if that's the case, then why is the HIV epidemic so much worse in the United States than it is in, say, Europe, right? There's no more gay people in the United States than there are in Europe. And the United States has way more circumcised guys, right? By the 80s, almost everyone, right? 75, 80% of the male population is going to be circumcised. And yet it's got this huge HIV epidemic that is not, they had problems with it in here, don't get me wrong, but the rates are much lower. But then in the first decade of the 2000s, we had a couple very famous or infamous, depending on studies on this in Africa. So these studies are very very contentious. They were done, I believe, in Uganda, Kenya, and maybe South Africa. Definitely Uganda and Kenya, maybe South Africa. Now the researchers who did this were advocates of routine infant circumcision. And when they launched this study, there were accusations that, well, it sounds like you're trying to go back and find a rationalization for this, right? You're doing experiments on Africans to try and justify what's going on in the United States to children. And they denied this and said, no, we're just trying to do research. And so they did these studies, and these were relatively large studies in Africa. And then they came back and they said that circumcision granted a massive benefit. They almost described it, quote, like a vaccine. Now, this apparently was before the COVID vaccine that doesn't really work. This was the circumcision vaccine that didn't really work either. So I forget the numbers, but it was several thousand. I think something like, it was less than 10,000 each. But they took large groups of men. These weren't children, obviously. They took adult men. So they divided them up into cohorts, and then they circumcised half of them and left the other half intact. And then after so many, I think it was a year. I'm not sure how long. Some of the men had gotten HIV. Now it turned out that the men who got circumcised caught HIV a little bit less. Now both instances it was very low. I think it was something like 2% of the uncircumcised men caught HIV, and about 1% of the circumcised guys caught HIV. And so there was approximately a 1% difference. Now, 1% in absolute terms doesn't sound very much, so the study announced it in relative terms and said it basically gave you a 60% something. I think the number was 60% relatively speaking protection, and they call it, quote, like a vaccine. And this got trumpeted in the press in the United States, and you still get it cited all the time, constantly, all the time, constantly, all the time, constantly. These studies get thrown in your face. Now, a couple things. I was born in 1983, so these studies didn't exist back then. So the idea that anyone who's reading or talking about circumcision right now or dealing with it was circumcised because of these studies is ridiculous, because the studies were done after. There are other serious questions. A large number of the people in the studies dropped out, so we don't know what happened to them, right? If 20% of the participants leave and you don't know their status, then who's to say, right? The other thing is they didn't track why or how people caught HIV. So let's say that you were uncircumcised and you caught HIV, but you didn't catch it from sex. You caught it because you were using drugs or because you're secretly a homosexual and you were bottoming, right? If you're bottoming, your chances of HIV are much higher than if you're topping. And if you're bottoming, it doesn't matter if you're circumcised or not. It might matter if your partner's circumcised or not, maybe hypothetically, but that wasn't tracked. The other problem is that the men who were circumcised could not have sex for a certain amount of time. They weren't supposed to have any sex for, I believe, 5 weeks. Maybe some of them cheated, maybe some of them didn't. But then you're just closing the window where they're likely to catch sex by catch anything by just saying you can't have sex for basically 2 months or 3 months or 1 or 2 months. The other thing is the men who got circumcised had to return for medical checkups. And at these medical checkups, they'd be given lectures about sexual health and safety and be given condoms. This didn't happen for the uncircumcised men. The uncircumcised men did not have to come back in for checkups. They did not give lectures on the benefits of condom use or their safety. And they weren't given free condoms every month for the entire study. So I don't see how anyone could not see that as a huge, huge variable, right? You have Group A and Group B, and you give Group B condoms and not Group A, and then say, oh, well, Group B is... So there's that. And then the other problem is that Uganda and Kenya and South Africa are just not the same as the West, right? There's so many other variables that are different. This is one of the basic arguments that a lot of people made. They said, well, look, Africa is not the U.S. The other problem, too, is that they are circumcising these guys as adults. People in the West are not circumcised as adults. They're circumcised as neonates normally. And yes, both are circumcisions, but they're not necessarily the same thing. And so translating that to the United States didn't make a lot of sense. But again, the authors of the study immediately trumpeted it as this, and so did the U.S. media. But now, thankfully, we have evidence that it doesn't apply to the West. So I put a link at the top of the description. If you look up, I'll put it in the description if you see this video later. It's in the chat up at the top, or you can just search circumcision and risk of HIV among males from Ontario, Canada. This is published in the Journal of Urology, the official journal of the American Urological Association, AmericanUrologicalAssociation.com. And I mean, we can read through the conclusions and everything. It's pretty brief. So it says right here, talking about these studies that we've just referenced. Purpose: randomized trials from Africa demonstrate that circumcision reduces the risk of acquiring HIV among males. However, few studies have examined this association in Western populations. We sought to evaluate the association between circumcision and the risk of acquiring HIV among males from Ontario, Canada. So, say what you will about Canada and Ontario, but it's epigenetically much closer to the United States than Uganda and Kenya, right? Whatever variables that are different between the two countries, and there are some, there's far, far, far fewer than there are between the United States and Uganda. Okay. Materials and methods. We conducted a population-based matched cohort study of residents in Ontario, Canada. We identified males born in Ontario who underwent circumcision at any age between 1991 and 2017. The comparison group consisted of age-matched males who did not undergo circumcision. The primary outcome was incident HIV. We used case-specific hazard models to evaluate the hazards of incident HIV. We performed several sensitivity analysis to evaluate the robustness of our results, matching our institution of birth, varying the minimum follow-up period, and simultaneously various false negative and false positive thresholds. Okay, so the results. We studied 569,950 males. Because I don't remember the exact numbers of the African study, but they weren't even a tenth that, including 203,588 who underwent circumcision and 366,362 who did not. The vast majority, 83% of circumcisions, occurred prior to age 1. So these are, except for 17% of them, all are circumcised in the first year of birth, which is the way it's almost always done in the West. In the primary analysis, we found no significant difference in the risk of HIV between groups. Adjusted hazard ratio 0.9, 95% confidence interval. In none of the sensitivity analysis do we find an association between circumcision and risk of HIV. In Ontario, with a study of 569,000, almost 570,000 males. Conclusions. We found that circumcision was not independently associated with the risk of acquiring HIV among males from Ontario, Canada. Our results are consistent with clinical guidelines that emphasize safe sex practices and counseling over circumcision as an intervention to reduce the risk of HIV. So, there we have it. They don't correlate. And it therefore seems basically certain that there's no causation there, at least in the West. The stuff in Africa is pretty weak and pretty questionable, but the stuff in the United States, or at least North America, I should say, I mean, Ontario is mostly south of the United States, so it's about as American as you can get in Canada, is none. Okay. And we know, for instance, that, within the United States, the groups that are most likely to get HIV are homosexuals, and among homosexuals, among gay guys, the most likely way to get it, the way it's most often transmitted, is through receptive anal intercourse. It's from bottoming. All right, you can get it from topping, but it's approximately 10 times harder to do. So since such a high proportion is happening from bottoming, it doesn't really matter if you're circumcised or not. And then, of course, lots of people who do drugs, right, intravenous drug use, sharing needles, that sort of thing, and that has nothing to do with whether you're circumcised or not. So I think that this is much stronger counter evidence, right? Anyone who is going to cite the African studies in favor of these studies, I think, since they're much larger and much closer to home, right, that there are just so many more variables that are the same. Never mind the other problems with the African studies, I think is willfully delusional at this point. It's sad to see that this stuff is not getting tons of play, right? If there's a study that shows there's even a chance that there might be a tiny, tiny positive effect of circumcision, right, it's front page news everywhere. And then when you have a study that shows that really it doesn't offer any protection to, the main reason that it should be done, the HIV tests, silence, crickets. No one talks about it. So all the more reason for me to cover it in a live stream. But yeah, let's see. So, yeah. So, glad they did this study. I'm kind of curious how long it took. Like, what was the time period? It sounds like they just surveyed all. That's a huge number of people to check up on. 2021 American Urological Association Education and Research Incorporated. Let's see if this has got picked up by anyone. I mean, it's nice the Canadians did this. Canadians have kind of already overcome a lot of this. The circumcision rates in Canada have plummeted, depending on the province, and that's also interesting too. It speaks to the, and there's actually been research on this. the number one determiner if a doctor favors circumcision, right? If you ask a doctor, do you think circumcision is a beneficial thing that should be done? The number one factor of whether they say yes or no is if they are themselves circumcised, or if they're a woman, if their family members are circumcised. So if you ask an uncircumcised doctor, they'll say no. If you ask a circumcised doctor, they'll probably say yes. And so what you'll see is like this Africa study, in Europe, it wasn't seen as evidence that circumcision is good. It was seen as a horrible study that raised a lot of ethical questions about experimenting on Africans, right? And, Gregory Malchuk, I see your comments here. There's evidence that it may, in the long run, be bad, because one of the things that they were saying it's like a vaccine, and that gave the impression that you would actually be protected. And if that makes someone behave more promiscuously or more riskily because they think that they're protected, then that actually could make the rates of circumcision or the rates of HIV go up. And it's kind of strange, because the only reason you would have it, because what the researcher said is, well, you still need to use a condom and you still need to use safe sex. Okay, but then what's the point of doing it, right? Because if you use a condom, then you'll be fine even if you're not circumcised. If you don't use a condom, the fact that you are circumcised doesn't really provide much protection, right? 1% at best. And many people who would opt to get circumcised would be doing it so that they could then have unprotected sex, because they prefer unprotected sex, right? Everyone prefers unprotected sex. It feels way better. So why go through that whole process of and here's the other thing. When you're circumcised, your sensitivity goes way down, right? You just lost like half your nerves, and the ones that are left are going to get numbed. So guess what? Putting on a condom is going to be that much worse. So like if you have a condom and you're uncircumcised, you're going to feel a lot more. An uncircumcised guy with a condom is going to feel more than a circumcised guy going raw, basically. I think there's going to be bell curves there, but there's going to be a big overlap showing that. And so, yeah, you've got these people who think that they're protected when they're not, and they're just going to be even more crazy and have more sex. So yeah, even the promoters admit circumcision has no value for gay men who are in the West or the drivers of HIV, unlike in Africa. Yeah, absolutely. Doesn't do you any good. What about phimosis? So 2 things about phimosis. One, it's not that big of a problem for most people. I know people who are adults who have phimosis, severe phimosis in some cases, also paraphimosis. Right, so I know people who have it, who are in their 30s, and they're fine. They have no problems. They've never seen their dickhead. They've never exposed their dickhead, and they never had a problem. I know other men who did have a problem with phimosis. Now, having a problem with phimosis could mean a couple things. It could mean that you were having infections and it was painful, and that does happen. I don't know what incidence it does, but it does happen. And you have other people who they don't have any medical problems, but they know that they have phimosis and they feel self-conscious about it, or their doctor, especially if you're in the United States, tells you that it's a problem. So in those cases, so that's the first thing. It's not always a problem. Second of all, it seems like about 2% of uncircumcised guys will have phimosis when they're an adult. Okay, so you don't circumcise everybody to cure 2% of them of phimosis, right? Just so we don't amputate the mammary glands of all women, because some of them will get very, very dangerous breast cancer later. Some of them will. Breast cancer kills thousands of people every year. It's a horrible disease. And if we got rid of the breasts of all women, we'd just not have a problem with it anymore. The other thing, too, you can't diagnose it when you're a child, because every child almost is going to have an unretractable foreskin. And this will only gradually change. Some of them it will retract when they're 4, some when they're 8, some when they're 10, some when they're 15, some when they're 18. It's only after 18 that you can start to question, hey, maybe this is phimosis. And then the third thing, BF, there are less... I mean, as an adult, if you want to get your phimosis treated, that's fine. That's ethically completely different than neonatal circumcision, right? To say I needed a treatment for something as an adult is not a reason to give that treatment to every single person who's born, regardless of whether they have that problem or not. That doesn't necessarily follow. In fact, it doesn't logically follow at all. The other thing is that if you want to have your phimosis treated, there's less invasive ways than circumcision, right? There are less invasive surgeries that don't remove any tissue, but just do some slitting and some cutting just to open it up. There's things called Phimocure, basically bands that you can insert into the opening to gradually open it. So BF, that's actually called paraphimosis, right? So I appreciate like your personal experience or whatever, but if you can retract your foreskin behind your head and it quote gets stuck, then you don't have phimosis, you have paraphimosis. Okay? Not everybody has that exact problem, and you can make your opening more elastic and bigger so that that doesn't happen without getting circumcised. All right? You can go online right now and type up Phimocure. Yes, your 13 or 13 year olds pretty much yes, but my 10 to 13 years old can pretty much gauge how bad their phimosis will. No, they can't. You cannot tell at someone at 10 or 13 how bad their phimosis is going to be or not going to be. Right? You can go on YouTube right now and find guys who did not fully retract until they were 15 or 16. They don't have phimosis. They just had that on. They just did not retract until they were older. You had both what? No, if you pulled it back to where it was behind your head, then you did not have phimosis by definition. If it was getting stuck, then you had paraphimosis. Sure. Okay, but there are other treatments other than circumcision, and it's totally different to do it to you as an adult who actually has it than to just assume every baby boy has phimosis, right? You can understand that, I hope, right? Like my aunt has breast cancer. She's had it. She was fine for 10 years. It's come back, right? And it's really bad. Breast cancer's really, really bad. But that doesn't mean that we go and take off the breasts, amputate the breasts of all 1-year-old little girls. What am I wrong? What am I missing up, BF? You say that I'm wrong and I don't know what I'm talking about, but you didn't even know that you had paraphimosis. So what am I getting wrong? You think that we should circumcise all baby boys because 2% of them might have phimosis, which is treatable with things other than circumcision. What is not accurate? Like it's easy to say that, but if you're not going to specify, then there's not really debate. You're just wrong, but you can't say how. Look, I know people who have phimosis as adults. I've met them. I've played around with them in bed. They're fine. I know that's not true with everybody. I do know people who had phimosis and they didn't like it and they had real problems with it. Okay, but that does not mean you circumcise all the boys. Yeah, BF is a troll. So to say that you had a real issue, which I'm not denying, and I'd say that it can be a real thing, but most guys don't have phimosis. Most guys will never get phimosis. Some guys who have phimosis can treat it on their own. I've helped people. You say the home remedies make stuff work. I've had guys who had phimosis. I gave them tips on stretching techniques, and 6 weeks later, a month later, they call me and they said it worked. It's great. Everything's perfect. Do you think foreskin restoration techniques could be helpful for uncut guys with tight foreskins? I couldn't retract until 15 after gradual stretching, but still a bit tight after that. Absolutely. Like I just said, I mean, I'm not going to help you personally, but you can look this up. I've done this with people, right? I met an uncut guy when I was in Washington, I gave him stretching techniques. I told him to look into them, and he said, okay, I'm going to try. And then like a month later, he called me. He was really excited. He's like, oh my God, I can fully retract. It feels amazing. And BF, if your stretching opens it enough that you can retract it behind the head, but you now have paraphimosis, all that means is that you need to stretch it a little bit more, and then it will be able to glide on and off the head easily. BF, you don't have a medical degree either, right? And again, well, BF, why Do you think the fact that some people have do you think the fact that some women have breast cancer means that all women should have mastectomies? Do you think that all women should have their breasts amputated because some women get breast cancer? Please answer that in your next comment. Because breast cancer, by the way, is way more serious than phimosis. Phimosis doesn't kill anyone. Breast cancer kills tens of thousands of people a year. So do you think that we should mastectomize all women before the age of 1 to prevent breast cancer cases? Okay, you didn't answer my question, so you're not arguing in good faith. Stretching does cure many. I don't want to say most, but it definitely is effective for lots of people. Yeah, stretching is very slow. Do you know what's really, really slow? Regrowing your fucking foreskin. That takes for fucking ever. Like, again, would you mastectomize all women because some of them have breast cancer? I have a foreskin. It's glorious. I used to wish I was circumcised thinking chicks would like it. So glad now. My analogy doesn't fit. Why? Because breast cancer is way worse than phimosis. It kills way more people. Right? And you don't need breasts to live. You can cut them off and you'll still survive. So what's the problem? Are you advocating that all baby boys be circumcised so 2% of them will not have to get phimosis treatments when they're older? Which, again, lots of people with phimosis never get treated. Okay. Well, you're probably right, Gregory, but it is part of the topic, right? So, yeah, you don't, yeah, stretching being slow. If you have a foreskin, you absolutely can use stretching techniques to make it longer. Like I said, I have a friend from Washington State. He had phimosis. He could not retract. He could retract a little bit, but he could not get it past his head. He never had. He was in his mid-20s, and I told him, look, I gave him some techniques, and they're not a chore. Let's just say that. They feel really good in his case. And I said, just try this and work on it, every time you masturbate, basically. And it wasn't right away. You're dodging the point, though. It's that most men will never get phimosis. It doesn't make the condition worse. Going from it can't retract at all to being able to retract behind your head, it got better. And yes, paraphimosis can be paraphimosis isn't good. I don't want to minimize it, but that just means you don't retract it until it's big enough that it will open. If you can open it enough to start doing paraphimosis, you can open it more to start doing full retraction. Like my friend, right, who calls me after, I think it was a few months later, but he just excitedly calls me. He's like, oh my God, I'm fully retracting and it feels really smooth. And I've actually done that more than once with people. Okay, fair enough. That's a good point. But again, that's not an argument to circumcise all boys, right? And you can have a less invasive procedure than circumcision, right? If you don't want to wait, they can do a dorsal slit or something like that. But again, it's one thing to say an adult decides to get it done. You're the one who's not understanding. It's one thing to say an adult who has a problem getting it done. It's another thing to say we should do it to all children in case they have a problem, because most of them won't. Most guys are not going to have phimosis. Most guys are not going to have paraphimosis. Most guys are not going to get their head stuck behind their head. Stretching is slow. Doesn't even come close to describing it. You can spend 10 years restoring vigorously and still have no erect coverage. It's frustrating because it does seem like results are all over the place. Some people legitimately seem to fully restore in a year. Some people work 10 years, like you said, 20 years even. I mean, I've seen guys who have been working on it for 20, 25 years, and it's almost an indistinguishable change. Now you have to wonder, what techniques they're using and how regimented they are, and that varies a lot. And I think that when I've seen surveys of men who consider themselves restored and they average the number out, it comes out to something like 7 years. It's very, well, it's not a straw man to say there are other surgeries that are less invasive, BF. Circumcision is not the only solution. These other solutions that you're dismissing, they work for a lot of people. The reason Phimocure is marketed as a product is because it's useful. People find it useful. The stretching techniques work. Do they necessarily work for everyone all the time? Maybe not. Okay, but they do work for a lot of people, and they're not dangerous per se. And there are less invasive procedures you can do. Like if you just look them up, it's just this go-to that people like to run to because doctors in the U.S. love to circumcise people, right? Doctors in the U.S. think you should be circumcised if you have no problems at all. They just look at foreskin as something that needs to be removed. It's just like ingrained in them because most of them are circumcised, right? And you have to rationalize that it's okay. If you confront the possibility, so then what are you arguing? What is your point, BF, that circumcision is something that you're not arguing that it should be done for children, then we don't disagree. If you're arguing that it's an option for somebody, it is an option. It's almost never the only option. Now, it's the go-to option in the U.S. The debate isn't anywhere close to that, though. The debate is, should it be done to neonates? And the answer is no. Can you diagnose phimosis in a 5-year-old or a 10-year-old or a 12-year-old? The answer is no. Are there other treatments besides circumcision that are less invasive? Yes. Does that mean that everyone is going to be up for them? No. Some people aren't. You apparently are not. There are less invasive surgeries too. All right. So for instance, you could have a high and tight cut, or you could just get rid of the acropostheon, or you could just do a slit. Okay. And what you're doing basically is arguing that circumcision is great and that it shouldn't be questioned, and that, because of phimosis, I mean, okay, it's good that you're not arguing this, but that comes across as circumcision is good. I want it done to all neonates. I'm arguing that I have no problem. If look, you own your body, man. You want to cut your dick off completely, that's your right to do it. I just wouldn't advocate it. I'm not saying that's what you want, but that's my philosophical position. It's just completely different to do it to a child. And you're talking about, well, a 13-year-old might not know. Doctor, no one knows when they're 13. You just don't know. They haven't even finished going through puberty. Their dick size hasn't finished. Well, there's the ones who kill themselves, right? And I've done videos on that. You've got the ones who die because of the circumcision directly. It's not many, but it happens. We've got Jewish babies who are getting herpes, and some of them get brain damage and die, right? And then you have... No, I'm saying let people choose. I'm just saying that a baby can't choose. I'm not saying circumcision should be banned for adults who want it. It should be legal for adults who want it. I don't think it's necessary. I don't think most people would use it, but it shouldn't be banned for adults who consent to it. It should be banned for children who are just getting it cosmetically or religiously. It doesn't kill all of them, sure, but it imposes risks and damages their penis for life. Yeah, some people do kill themselves, and some people just die from the surgery, right? You have a baby. Have you ever had... There's actually a correlation that's also a little explored between circumcision and SIDS, sudden infant death syndrome. Yeah. Anyway, so maybe that's Brian Morris right there. No, I doubt it. He goes much further than that. So anyway, this is a really good study, right? It's a large study. It's in an area that is much more epigenetically similar to the United States. The idea that we can justify doing this to infants because of a really shady, disreputable study that was done in Uganda at this point 13 years ago versus one that's done in Ontario that's much larger, that's much more recent, is ridiculous. And I would just love to, because in debates on this topic, the people who really try and rationalize it, nobody wants to say, well, it's a cultural phenomenon. It's just part of our culture now. So they don't want to say that. They want to be able to say there's a scientific reason. Oh, it's because of a protection it gives to something else. And the number one reason that they were going to give is HIV, because it's, HIV is a serious disease, right? It's not as serious as COVID apparently, but it's a serious disease. And yeah, so, yeah, so this is a good antidote, right? I'd love to see the people out there on YouTube who I've seen really bend over backwards to try and justify this. And, I'll be fair to you, BF, you're not arguing for doing this to neonates. So good for you. That's where we don't disagree. We fundamentally don't disagree. Circumcision is an overly abused surgery. Right? There's lots of surgeries that could be good in one context, but then wouldn't be good to just do everybody carte blanche. For example, mastectomies. Sometimes mastectomies make sense, right? My aunt had her breast removed because she had cancer of her breasts. So I'm not saying it's bad to have your breast amputated, because sometimes it's okay. Sometimes it's necessary, right? Sometimes it's the only thing you can do, and an adult can choose to do that. But the thing is, we're not going and giving mass mastectomies to all little girls. 75% of little girls before the age of 1 are not having their boobs amputated, right? So mastectomies are not getting abused in that way. Circumcision is, because we're circumcising hundreds or thousands of boys to prevent one of them from getting phimosis, which could be easily treated when they're an adult or later, whether through circumcision or something else. So circumcision is abused as a surgery in that way. I'll concede that there are, first of all, I'll concede it straight up. As a consenting adult, you can decide to do whatever, whether or not this procedure has any effect. Circumcision is a potential treatment for some ailments, especially pretty much exclusively phimosis, really. Maybe balanitis, one or two others. Usually it's not the only option. But okay, you don't think it's as bad, but you don't advocate doing it to neonates, and you're not justifying it done to neonates. Or are you saying it's okay to do it to neonates? I mean, if we were to amputate the breasts of little girls, they wouldn't die. They would live. And they'd be able to reproduce in all likelihood as well. So that mean it's okay, right? Some of them might commit suicide, but it wouldn't be very many, so it's fine, right? I mean, breast cancer is way worse than phimosis. You know that. What kills? I mean, phimosis doesn't kill anybody. Not to diminish it, not that it can't be a real problem, but it doesn't kill anybody. But breast cancer does. Thousands, tens of thousands. Okay, so can a parent choose to circumcise their daughter? Can parents decide they just want their tonsils cut out or their appendix removed just because because sometimes tonsillectomies and appendectomies are justified procedures. Sometimes they are. Not always, but if they're, it's like if it's allowed in some medical conditions, then obviously the parents can just decide to do it to their children no matter what, right? So if a parent just wants to say, hey, take out the tonsils, take out the appendix, take out the clitoris, that's all fine because the child will live. Penile cancer is one of the rarest form of cancers. And again, breast cancer is way more common than penile cancer. So do you think a parent has the right to amputate their daughter's breasts? Women are protected by from FGM in this country. Yeah, Dark Gaza, it was a federal crime to touch it's a federal crime to even touch a knife to a female genitals, or at least it was until that law was struck down by a Jewish judge. No, BF, you're saying that parents can circumcise their children no matter what, regardless of how micro the percentage is, right? I guess they have the right to amputate any healthy tissue that they want. So again, all right. And suicide from mastectomy is super rare too. So again, can parents decide? Can parents decide to amputate the breasts of their daughters? Right, since breast cancer is such a serious issue. I've asked that a couple times, BF, and you just don't want to answer. Right? She'll live. The girls will live. They won't miss their boobs because they won't have them. Especially if we do it to 85% of the population. All the girls will be boobless. And then they'll never have to clean them either. They'll be... All right. Lol indeed. Well done, troll. I mean... Well, no, I'm using your goalpost, right? You're saying, well, it's just parents can do whatever they want to their kids. Okay, so they can do... I actually saw Brett and Heather Weinstein say that circumcision is both evolutionary justified and evolutionary not justified. And the reason that they gave is that it's cultural practice. No. First of all, the connection between foreskin and penile cancer is not well attested. The studies are very old, and they've said that there may have been other complicating issues because there was, in the populations that they did, this was done in the UK, by the way, that the uncircumcised population were just a totally different socioeconomic class than the circumcised. So we don't know that that's actually what was causing it. And breast cancer is way more common than both, right? So that's not moving the goalpost back, it's moving it forward. Breast cancer kills tens of thousands of people a year, more than phimosis, more than penile cancer, right? And so therefore, is it okay for parents to cut off all their daughters' breasts? The unfortunate truth is that in the USA, parents and doctors basically can do anything. I look into what more? Phimosis is rare. It's not serious. It can be treated with things other than circumcision as an adult. It can be treated with circumcision as an adult. That's not an excuse to do it to all children, right? The principle that you're invoking here doesn't make any sense. It's basically, if there's a medical procedure that might be useful to an adult, it is therefore justifiable to do it to all children. Yes. Weinstein said that circumcision is like the foreskin evolved. So they're evolutionary, psychiatrists or whatever, evolutionary biologists. So he acknowledged that foreskins evolved, and so therefore they must have some adaptive reason. But he then also believes in cultural evolution. So he says circumcision has persisted as a cultural trait, therefore it's adaptive in that way. So he said both foreskin is adaptive and circumcision is adapted. But as people pointed out in the comments, he would never, ever say that about female circumcision. But it's also culturally adaptive, okay? Females' circumcision is almost as common as male circumcision. It's very, very common and has persisted for thousands of years. And he would never, ever make that claim. So I think his cultural bias, I give him credit for as far as he took it, and he seems more open to it than many, but I think his cultural bias really colored, because he would never say that for female circumcision. But BF, breast cancer kills thousands of people, tens of thousands of people. It's a way more... Can you acknowledge that breast cancer is a much worse disease and much more common than anything associated with foreskin? I think circumcision is way worse than mastectomy. Yeah, there's way more pleasure in your dick than in your boobs. Were you able to complete restoration? I have not completed it yet, but I've made a lot of progress. It's definitely to the point where a lot of people assume that I'm uncircumcised. So what I think the sad truth is, though, this study, like, it's going to get ignored. The media is not going to talk about it, and doctors are not going to talk about it. Although this was published in the urology magazine or whatever. But then the other problem is that the advocates of circumcision will just find another rationale. For instance, phimosis. BF, it's relevant because you're justifying circumcision on the grounds that there's a chance that as an adult you could have a problem, right? You could end up really having phimosis, which we agree. Phimosis can really happen. It's not super common and it's not super serious, but it can really happen. But it doesn't happen to most people, right? Because something happens to an adult is not a justification to do it to all children, all right? If that is true, and you're saying it's true for circumcision, you're saying, well, you might get phimosis, therefore your parents have a right to circumcise you as a baby. Whether or not they have any evidence that you'll ever have it or not, that's just something they can choose to do. And also, you've just said parents have the right to make decisions like that. Well, if that's the case, many girls will get breast cancer, and many of them will die. Many more of them will die than will die of penis cancer or will die of phimosis. Nobody dies of phimosis, which is not to diminish that it could be an issue for some people. It is an issue for some people. That issue is not fatal. It's not fatal. All right. So breast cancer is way worse and way more common. And yet you will not ever say that it's okay for a parent to decide to give a mastectomy to their daughter on just the chance that maybe one day she'll have breast cancer. Yeah, the true statement. The study will probably be ignored, but it should be pointed out in debates from now on. You know, when we have guys on YouTube or wherever who are arguing, oh, look at the Africa study, we can just say, look at the Ontario study. Fuck the Africa study. Look at the Ontario study. I mean, there's a ton of problems. Look, the Africa studies did not withstand scrutiny. There were so many points you could poke holes in them, and people have. But this is so much easier and faster to just say, look at fucking Ontario. Who fucking cares about Uganda? These are guys who were circumcised when they were adults. The people who were circumcised were given condoms and given lectures on their efficacy, and Uganda and Kenya are not translatable, comparable societies. They're about as different a society as you can get in terms of their, their epidemiological setting. So Ontario is much, much, much better. It's a much bigger study, and it's much more analogous, right? Because we're not talking about guys getting circumcised as adults, present company accepted. There's a bunch of diseases you can have from a faulty boob. There's a bunch of diseases you can have from a faulty anything, BF. Every part of your body can have problems. Every part. Your foreskin can have problems. Your glands can have problems. You can get infections in your breast. You can have cysts. And who cares if it's the only problem? It's a bigger problem. Breast cancer is going to kill more people than all the combined problems with your foreskin. You can list 20 problems with the foreskin. None of them are major and none of them are fatal. And breast cancer can kill tens of thousands of people every year. I never thought it prevented HIV. I believe it's the reverse. So parents can choose. Well, talk about, okay, it's not the worst. Yes, you're right. It's not the worst. They could kill their children, right? But who's moving the goalpost now, BF? Oh, circumcision is not the worst. Yeah, circumcision is not the worst, right? They could kill their children or chop off their arms or something, right? That would be worse. I'm not saying it's the worst thing you can possibly do. I'm saying it's unjustified, right? It's wrong. It's wrong to do it to a baby, right? Just like it's wrong to circumcise your daughter, right? Even though you can have all the problems you list with male circumcision, all the problems you can have with male foreskin, you can have with female foreskin, right? The clitoris can get infected, the labia can get infected. It's not as serious as breast cancer, and you can get a kidney infection even if you're uncircumcised or even if you're cut. So yeah, the African study doesn't count as randomized placebo-controlled trial. Yeah, they were giving out condoms to the cut guys repeatedly and lectures on safe sex. It was so blatant that I don't think it was a good faith study. I think that they were, it was motivated reasoning. They were trying to find a justification for circumcision. And that's the thing. When that study is debunked or when better studies come up, that's still going to be the case. The doctors in the United States, I mean, this is slowly changing because the circumcision rates are falling. So there's going to be more and more doctors who are uncircumcised. We're just getting to the point now where the youngest doctors out there are more likely to have foreskin, and so it's going to be less and less common. I've read that the penis cancer is more common in the US than in Europe. I don't know if that's true or not, but it wouldn't surprise me. Doctors also advocate circumcision for non-retractable foreskin, which I believe make up the majority of them. Yeah, so there's what they call congenital. So there's real phimosis, which it sounds like BF had. So real phimosis is you can't retract your foreskin as an adult. But it's perfectly natural for children to not be able to retract their foreskins. That's normal. And it gradually, with every age cohort, it gradually more and more of them can retract. And I believe the age is around 10 when half of them can do it. And it's not until 18 that you start to say, hey, they might have phimosis. That was termed congenital phimosis for many years. And you had many, many doctors in the U.S. who would find a 5-year-old or an 8-year-old or a 10-year-old and say, can you retract their foreskin? And if they said no, they would tell them that they should get circumcised. And many, many, many. You're not in the medical field. Okay, so you work as a janitor, you work as a doctor, but I don't care if you are. Your arguments don't make any sense. In children with connective tissue diseases, you can predict higher incidence of phimosis. What do you care, BF? You think parents should be able to do it no matter what. They don't need to show that a child has connective tissue diseases, right? This is like, I've had this debate with Jewish doctors, right? I do talk to doctors. I have a Jewish doctor friend who I said, well, you wouldn't circumcise, you wouldn't mastectomize all women because of breast cancer. He goes, well, actually, if they have the BRCA2 gene, which means there's a high likelihood. Yeah, but you're not saying that we should only circumcise guys if they show that there's a likelihood that they'll have phimosis, right? Which it's perfectly treatable, right? Phimosis, I mean, you're the one who started talking about cancer and whatnot, but like phimosis is perfectly treatable. It's not serious. It's perfectly treatable with circumcision and with other methods, right? So there's no reason to circumcise everybody, hoping to stop some cases of circumcisions. Okay, but it's probably cheaper to cut off baby boobs than it is to cut off adult boobs, and they won't remember it either. It doesn't make sense but what you're also implying there, BF, is that you circumcise dozens or hundreds of babies who don't need it and won't need it just to make it a little bit easier for the one who might, right? Just because you needed to get circumcised doesn't mean everyone else should have been circumcised just so that it would be easier for you, right? That doesn't make any sense. Really? I mean, how about this? You don't want to stand out, right? Say you had to have your hand cut off because of a horrible accident, and you don't want to stand out. So you think everyone should have their hands cut off as babies so that you don't stand out and you don't have to feel like you don't fit in. No. No, because you don't know that they're actually gonna have a problem. Okay, they're not at risk if they wait until they're adults for the issues you're talking about. You're not going to die of phimosis. You're not going to have huge problems because of phimosis. You can wait and get it treated later. And sometimes that treatment will, and sometimes it will not involve circumcision. You just don't do it to everyone. And I don't even know why you're making these arguments, because you've made it clear that parents just have the right to do whatever they want. Well, when it comes to foreskin, not to anything else. So what other healthy body parts can parents just decide to cut off? Is it only the male foreskin, or can they circumcise their daughters? Because, yeah. Well, Gregory, I don't know if I agree that that's the only way, but I think that you're right that the medical industry is too compromised and too invested in this for it to ever really, like, they would have to admit wrongdoing, so they never will. If there are ways to successfully sue them. Okay, well, I agree with that. Places where parents and young children are, blah, blah. Well, you can only not do medical misinformation for COVID. You can do that for circumcision, though. BF, why are you even watching my videos? Like, what other healthy body parts can parents decide on their own just to cut off? Is it only the male foreskin, or are there other parts that your philosophy allows? Because that's the other problem that always comes up, is like, people draw this philosophical line that would justify circumcision, but there's no way to draw that line that wouldn't also include a ton of other things that people would just completely recoil at. Breasts, labia, clitorises, a clitoral hood, earlobes, right? I mean, can you blame them? But yeah, let me post this. Let me post the study again, because it's kind of far back there now. Oh, did I lose it? Oh, here it is. Okay, good. There we go. Mystery revealed. Oh, BF, you're not the first one to tell me that. But you can't please everyone. Some people like it, some people don't. It's just like the beard. Some people love beards and some people hate them. You know, you just got to pick your poison. So they're just sociopaths with a penchant for harming someone who can't defend themselves. I think this is definitely true with some of them. I don't think it's true with most or all, but there are definitely doctors who like fetishize doing it. Edgar Schoen was one. He's dead now, so you can say that. And I think Brian Morris is another one. The people in the Gilgal Society apparently like to watch videos of babies getting circumcised. It's like hot for them. And there does seem to be the whole, it's not just doctors though, because you have the whole adamant father syndrome, where you have like a father who, maybe it's the wife, maybe it's a doctor who's telling them it's not necessary or shouldn't be done, and the doctors will, the dad will just become adamant. It needs to be done. It needs to be done. It needs to be done. Like, I look like Harvey Dent, like with half my face covered. Does it look that scarred? I did, Spurger King, half my face literally did burn off, but it wasn't a half. It was the lower half. It was this part of my face burned off, not like half. Brian Morris is hands down the creepiest one of all. Edgar Schoen was up there too, but he's dead now. Fortunately, Brian is isolated in Australia, and he's actually he's the one-man generator of almost all the pro-circumcision stuff that's out there. he'll publish all these aggregate studies where, what's his name? Is it Brian Earp? I think it's Brian Earp. Brian Earp's been pretty good on this. And he talks about how, like, if there's, so this study, let's say this gets published. So what's happening somewhere in the world right now is Brian Morris is writing a letter to the Urological Society. And he's going to say in his letter that this is a bad study. He'll find some reason to say it's bad. Whatever it is. Maybe they'll publish it, maybe they won't. If they don't publish it, he'll write the letter someplace else where it will get published. He'll find some place to publish a letter saying that this study doesn't mean anything, right? That there's a problem with this study. Then, the year after that, he'll do a meta-analysis, and he'll say, I looked at all the studies about circumcision, and I found that on net, circumcision protects you from HIV and it's beneficial, right? And he'll say in the study that the studies, like he'll say the ones in Africa are good, and then he'll acknowledge this study in Ontario, but then what he'll say is, I'm discounting the one in Ontario because questions were raised about its validity, right? He'll say the Ontario study was discredited, and so I'm not counting it in my net meta-analysis. Failing to mention the reason it was discredited is because he wrote a letter to the Australian Institute of Circumcision Research or whatever, rebutting or refuting or raising issues with the study. And so then he'll use his own objections as a way to just omit all data that he doesn't like, right? And so then he'll put meta-analysis, circumcision's great and he'll just pyramid off the same studies, the Africa study, and studies like this Ontario study will just become completely obliterated. And Brian Earp did a great thorough analysis of how that works. I think it's called The Sorcerer's Apprentice or something like that. That's a great article. Who supplied this money for the study? I don't know. It seems like that would be an expensive study. Does it say? Let's see. View all author information. Let's do that. Madhar Nayan, Robert Hamilton, David Gerlink, Peter Austin, Keith Jarvie. Oh, what's this? Click this link. Oh, do they have the PDF of the whole study? Let me click this. Oh, you've got to it's $39, guys. It's $39. And click the news. Does circumcision actually help to prevent HIV? See, look at, this is interesting. So yeah, this is Yahoo News. It's about this study. Many studies. Okay, let's read this. This should be interesting. This is clearly biased because the title buries the lead, right? It doesn't just say study shows it doesn't. You could read this title and wonder, maybe. Many studies, mostly out of Africa, have drawn conclusions that circumcision is effective at reducing STIs, including HIV. Okay, that was one study. They also found that it made it more likely that women would get HIV, so they canceled that study and didn't, because it was ethically wrong. But a new study out of Canada, the first conducted in a Western nation, drew no such connection. The results of the study were recently reported in the Journal of Urology under the title Circumcision and Risk of HIV Among Males from Ontario, Canada. Researchers with the University of Toronto Urology and Pediatrics Department looked at the experiences of nearly 570,000 men in the Canadian province. Blah, blah, blah. So the study conclusions stated, we found that circumcision was not independently associated with the risk of acquiring HIV among males from Ontario, Canada. Our results are consistent with clinical guidelines, blah, blah, blah. Then it says the effectiveness of circumcision. So this isn't the study. This is Yahoo at this point. The effectiveness of circumcision in preventing HIV appears to be most beneficial when it comes to heterosexual men. According to the Centers for Disease Control, male circumcision can reduce a man's risk of acquiring HIV infection by 50 to 60% during sex with HIV-infected female partners, according to data from clinical trials. Okay, so it's basically like, oh, we found a study that showed there's no connection. Well, let's talk about a study that said there was a connection. So it's interesting here. Notice what they say, that it provides some protection for men having sex with HIV-positive females. So what they're omitting there is in the Africa studies, they also tried to track how common it was for women to get it. So if you have a woman who's negative and a partner who's positive, and the partner is positive or circumcised or uncircumcised, is it more or less likely that she'll become HIV positive? And it turned out in their study that the women who had circumcised partners were getting HIV more, i.e., the circumcised men were more likely to give HIV to a woman. So what ended up happening? This was happening so much that they canceled that part of the study. And they said, this is an unethical study because too many of the women are getting HIV from their circumcised, male partners. So we're going to cancel that study. And so then it gets published. But here's the thing. Let's say that their effect, that the circumcision really was protecting some men, but if it was making more women at risk, then it doesn't make sense. And it's also interesting. Many of the men who were circumcised were getting HIV too, but that wasn't unethical. So if it looks like the study is going to show that there's no protection, then it's unethical, and they cancel the study. If it looks like there might be a benefit, then it doesn't matter how many people get HIV. The study is ethical, and they'll carry through with it. Let's see. There are more studies this Yahoo article. It's making it sound like there's some question here, and yeah, they're trying to bury the lead. That's it. Oh, these are old articles. Experts see strides on AIDS, but COVID halted progress. Oh, shit. That's it. One news article on Yahoo, and it tries to make it sound like, oh, well, sure, this study in Ontario showed there was no connection, but this 13-year-old study, 14-year-old study in Africa showed that there is one. So, maybe that's the way to go. They're rolling out the mRNA vaccines against HIV. Their boogeyman could die. Not that it stopped them with penile cancer, but yeah, they'll always come up with something. It's like I said at the beginning. It's a cure in search of a disease. Like guys who are circumcised very often want other guys to be circumcised, and if they're a doctor or they're in a position of, they're a lawyer, if they're a judge, if they're a father, right, they're in a position to do it. This is an Abrahamic religions pushing for cult reasons. Guilty, you'd be right for Judaism and Islam. You'd be wrong for Christianity. Christianity has never pushed circumcision. It's been largely anti-circumcision for most of its existence. And to the extent that it's popular now among Christians, it's not for theological, it's for cultural reasons. Yeah, more intact doctors mean more intact babies. I'm afraid that's the way it's going to be now. There are people on the margins, right? Research has shown, like the I forget the organizations exactly, but like the big intactivist organizations, well, BF, watch the start of the screen. I talk about the history. The big reason it was medically first put out The first medicalized justification for circumcision was to cure spermatorrhea. Have you ever heard of spermatorrhea? It's a made-up disease. It's any kind of seminal emission that's not into your wife when you're procreating. That's spermatorrhea. And it was thought that this could make you weak, could make you insane, neurological. And so the way that they thought to treat that was to circumcise you. And then they thought it would protect you from syphilis, which was the big disease in the late 19th century. And of course, it doesn't protect you from, okay, now we know he's a troll. Thank you for coming out. So, and I'll repeat this because it's good, because I said at the beginning of the screen when nobody is watching. Circumcision has always been rationalized by whatever the disease is of the hour, right? If cancer is the big deal, as it was in the start of the 20th century, they started saying, oh, it'll protect you from cancer. Before that, it was syphilis. Before that, it was spermatorrhea. And then it became UTIs. And now for the last 14, 15 years, it's been HIV. Christians in America heavily pushed for cutting boys like Kellogg. Why didn't the church disown these people? So this is a pet peeve of mine. Kellogg definitely did preach circumcision and advocate circumcision, and he was a very influential medical writer, and his sanitarium in Michigan was very like influential in his day, and his cornflakes, which it was actually he invented cornflakes, but then his brother is the one who started the company and kind of popularized them. But it is wrong to think that we are getting circumcised because of Kellogg. It was medical books, medical procedures that made it popular, and it was surgeons. I mean, surgeons. There was no other treatment for anything other than surgery. So it's one of those, if you only have a hammer, everything looks like a nail. If you only have a surgical kit, then the solution to everything is surgery. And circumcision is an easy surgery to do. And there were all this plethora of things that they claimed that it could help you, funnily enough, UTIs are largely associated with abortion. I'll have to look into that. That's interesting. Yeah, circumcision is definitely declining. It's not declined as much as it should have, or it's going slower than it should, and it's not as widespread as people initially thought, but it's definitely happening. And you're definitely seeing more and more uncut guys who are younger. It's like just the fact. I just had an interesting conversation actually with a straight guy that I know, right? So I don't only talk to gay guys, but this was a guy who is... I've known him for a long time. He's a senior in college now. I met him when he was in high school. I was working in Wyoming, and he went to the YMCA that I went to. And we spotted for each other. We got to be friends. We started talking. And he was pretty big gym goer, but he would never shower. He'd never get naked. So I never saw him naked. I didn't know his circumcision status, certainly. Maybe 4 years after, 2 or 3 years after I met him. So he was, I think, a freshman in college. We had a chance to hang out in a sauna, a steam room at the YMCA, which we did. And as we were stripping down, he was doing the fig leaf maneuver. He was holding his hand like over his crotch, and like walking through the locker room with his hand over his crotch. And I was like, bro, it's fine. No one cares. Just relax. And he did. And we spent the next 2 hours chatting and getting to know each other. And it's a really good platonic bonding experience. And to my surprise, he was uncircumcised. We didn't talk about it at the moment. I didn't want to put him on the spot. I didn't know if he cared about it or not. And I left the area, and I never saw him again, but we, we're already in contact. We talked a little bit. And then this summer he contacts me, and he said he's at the YMCA, and he's thinking about, the time that we spent together. And it's because I have a foreskin. It made me sneeze. We started talking again, And we got a lot closer. Like we were having some more in-depth conversations, and he eventually, not right away, revealed that he'd played football and had gym classes, and they always took showers, and he always covered up his uncut dick. Like he covered it every single time he was naked in front of people. Even though this guy is huge, he's 6'4", big, powerful, strong athlete. He can squat 550 pounds. He can bench 390. He's a big guy. It wasn't oil wrestling, although I was working on an oil rig, and we were at a gym, but it was platonic. But he tells me that he was always ashamed of his dick. He was always ashamed for being uncircumcised. He said that every guy that he ever saw was cut. And that day that he spent with me, which at this point was over 2 years ago, he said when I told him to move his hand and just to relax, not to worry, he said he'd never been open with his body before, and it really affected him. He was really like, wow, I can be myself, and I'm not going to be judged. And it may not have seemed like a big deal at the time, but 2 years later, he'd never forgot, and we continued to be close friends. We're closer now than we ever were, and that actually, I mean, to go into my other side topic here, the communal showering aspect of that, the platonic nudity, really did break down barriers and allow us to become a lot closer. And in his particular case, it also allowed him to open up about being uncircumcised. But the thing is, that's becoming much more common, right? And it's actually getting, in some places, especially on the West Coast, the left coast, the gods, the thought that someone would be ashamed of being intact. Yeah, this guy is a beast. And it was funny because he said, and I know this because I'd seen other members of his team. I mean, he got a full ride scholarship to do track in college. So he's a Division I athlete in college. So he's a big, strong guy. And he was the biggest, strongest guy on his football team in high school by far. And yet he was completely ashamed of his dick and would not show it to anyone. South African men seem to be proud of them. As a Pacific Northwesterner, I was ashamed in the shower room. Ashamed of what? Being cut or uncut? Lengthy, what is your current C level? I'm a C5, maybe a C6 at this point. Last I checked. Oh, I'm missing some of these conversations, it looks like. I think Cirque was almost outlawed in Iceland. It's especially unpopular in Scandinavian countries. It was almost banned in Iceland, but there's a very tiny Jewish minority there. It's literally less than 200. I think it's 250 people, something like that. And then about 1,000 Muslims. And the Muslims didn't really, I mean, they probably were against it, but they didn't raise a huge hue and cry. But Jewish organizations in the United States threatened to boycott Iceland, and they are very dependent on U.S. tourism. Now, I don't think that boycott would have been official. Like, I don't think we would have seen sanctions against Iceland or anything like that. But they were threatened enough by it that they dropped it. Germany also tried to, I mean, there was a German court that basically said it's illegal. And then they're like, well, you're Nazis now. This is like, you're being like Nazis for banning circumcision. They just back right off that. So, Kill Dog, you're uncut and you were ashamed of your foreskin. Well, how do you feel now? Also, Kill Dog, the guy that I helped get over his phimosis was from Washington State. I actually know a lot of uncut guys in Washington State. It's pretty common there. What's my CI goal? I mean, ideally, I would like to have full erect coverage, so like C9 or C10, but that's going to take forever. Yeah, my foreskin made me sneeze. Sorry. All right, guys. So pretty sad to see there's only one article about this, and it's kind of misleading. It attempts to like minimize, and then it has a picture of a guy with a cup banana. Come on. Do you think that image is like they've got like copyrights? Are there comments on this? Let me look. Ooh, it's so fucking annoying. All the fucking links. Everything. It's like it's impossible to avoid clickbait. It's terrible. The nation of South Sudan hopes to circumcise 1.5 million men in effect to curtail HIV. Oh my God. Ugh. Oh. Of the 203,588 who were circumcised, 0.0002505 contracted HIV. Of the 366,362 men who were not circumcised, 0.0002484 contracted HIV. So actually, these uncircumcised guys were less likely to get HIV. How much less likely? Oh, watch how bad I am at math. 0.123 2505 minus. So the circumcised men were 0.000021% more likely to get HIV, which, okay. Out of a study with 570. Okay, so if I'm reading this right, so the study of 570,000 guys, one more guy who got HIV who was circumcised than who was uncircumcised. One. So it's the same, right? Of that big of a study, it's the same. Yeah, so I mean, obviously, I don't have a lot of experience with heterosexual sex, but it does seem from the descriptions that I've read from females and males and people who've experienced both, and also from bottoms who've experienced both, is that uncircumcised feels a lot, quote unquote, smoother. It glides in a way that a cut penis usually doesn't. Yeah, let me post the article for those who want to see it. So this is going to be the Yahoo article, which tries to downplay the study. Boom. There it is for everyone who wants to see it. I've been following you for about 5 years or so. Oh, thanks. What made you start following me? I mean, that's a huge study. It's a 570,000 person sample. Yeah. Foreskins are much smoother, and it's much more of a gliding action. They got their own lube. They feel better, right? Which I almost think is make you more likely to use a condom because you can still get sensitivity out of it. Let's see. theory is that uncut helps to prevent HIV. The man thrusts inside of his foreskin, creating less friction. Circumcised men have more friction with greater risk of abrasions, HIV versus trans. Yeah, and it's probably marginal. I don't think it's a huge difference, but that would make total sense. Right there with you, wanting full erect coverage, but been restoring for 9 years, and I'm starting to think it's not possible without a friend or band and a frenulum. Maybe, cross that bridge when I get there, man. It's taking long enough just to get flaccid coverage that who knows. I'm not quite as long, but I don't have it for a couple of years, and I think it was during the search for restoration-related content. Oh, there we go. Yeah, so it started off completely as a libertarian channel, and I'm still completely a hardcore libertarian. I've, joined the Free State Project years ago. Now, Free State Project's getting cool. Tim Pool's talking about it constantly. And then I started talking about circumcision and foreskin, and then more recently communal showers, and it's kind of grown since then. Yeah. If the lies were true, AIDS would have been worse everywhere without mutilation culture. Yeah. So this is a good point. If it was true, then AIDS should be much worse in Europe. It should be much worse in South America. It should be much worse in Australia. It should be much worse in China and Japan. And then Africa is a really mixed bag, because there's parts of Africa where circumcision's common, and there's parts of Africa where it's not. And I don't know how much it correlates, if at all. But, in quote-unquote Western societies, the one that has the most HIV by far is the U.S. And among Western societies, the one that is the most circumcised and has been the most circumcised since HIV's been a thing, more of the Anglosphere, there are big parts of the Anglosphere that were circumcised in the 20th century. It was up to about a third of men in the UK, but it started to decline in the 1940s and significantly in the 1950s and 60s. So by the time HIV came around, it was relatively uncommon. The same happened, sliding scale, a little bit later in Australia and New Zealand. Both of those countries had pretty high circumcision rates. They both started to decline very rapidly in the early 1970s. And then Canada lagged even further behind. Canada, it seems like, it depends on the provinces, because the provinces are what handle the healthcare, and basically provinces have shifted their policies. So some of the provinces never picked up circumcision. So Quebec and the Maritimes, for instance, it was never very popular. But places like Ontario, Manitoba, Saskatchewan, Alberta did. And then they have been dropping it. So like I talked to some guys in Saskatchewan, including one who was a nurse, and he said that you could accurately gauge when a guy was born based on his status. And I think at the time it would be currently guys who are like 27 and under are going to be uncircumcised, and guys who are 28 and older are going to be guys who are 27 and younger will be uncircumcised, and guys who are 28 and older will be cut. Right. So, but since the HIV crisis, which HIV was introduced into New York City probably around 1971, we started to get the first kind of big outbreak in the 80s, because it takes on average 7 years for it to metastasize to HIV, to AIDS. And it's been much worse in the United States than any of these other countries, despite the fact that we're the circumcised country. Well, thank you, Ron. I'm glad that people appreciate it. No, BF, you're not banned. I didn't shadow ban you, but I gave you a lot of attention, right? You got more comments than everybody else, and now I'm not talking to you anymore. It's that simple. taken me about 10 years to get an RC3. My goal is RC9. Also, Jacob, props for using the RCI index. I think that's a much better one than the coverage index. The amount of time has been so discouraging. Hearing your progress and goals makes me feel so much better. Well, one thing I think that is true, and other restorers in the thread, if you're out there, please chime in. I think I'm experiencing this myself, and probably you are as well, Jacob. Right around when you start, the more you have, the faster you can grow. So like the slowest progress is, 1, 2, 3. When you start getting 4, 5, 6, it can start to accelerate, because the more skin you have, the more mitosis cells you have, the more it can grow. I know we had a public breakup. I'm sorry, BF. I thought if I broke up with my boyfriend on a live stream, it would get more views, but alas, not. Yeah, it's frustrating with the restoration, because we don't actually have like convincing data what the best techniques are. You have all this anecdotes, and you've got the people who do 24 hours of tugging versus 2 hours of high tension and everything in between, and you kind of only have what people say, and nobody's that consistent to really make it empirical, and so you just got to find what works best for you, unfortunately. I've gone from 0 to 5 in under 5 years. Yeah. I mean, there are credible reports of people doing it in a year. I think that that's very unlikely, though, and something like 4 years is like something that would be you could hope for, but I think on average it's more like 7. You need to acknowledge there's a point in stretching when the foreskin will get stuck behind the glands. BF, I'm the one who told you the name for what that's called. It's called paraphimosis. I know what that is. 2 things about it. It's not that serious. Yeah, you can have problems with it, but it's not that serious. And it can be treated with things other than circumcision. And also, it is not a justification for doing it to all babies, right? You need to acknowledge that just because some adults can have a problem is not a justification for it being done to all infants or whatever infants the parents want. Right? Because some people can have phimosis does not give the parents the right to just circumcise their babies willy-nilly, any more than the fact that some women will get breast cancer means parents can just decide to have their daughter's breasts removed, right? C3 took mere months for me. Yeah, sometimes people get a lot of progress early on too, like they've just never put tension on it, just kind of growth spurts. And then there's the whole, it depends on your shape of your anthropometry. If your gland is a lot wider in diameter than your shaft, you can get, quote, stuck behind the hump. You can have the situation where the skin bunches up behind the head, and age stats are generally correct lengthy as a nurse. What age stats? You're talking about the cut or uncut guys, and if you're a nurse, where? What has been so discouraging is that I still don't have enough slack skin to use a device, so I have to use manual methods, which takes so much effort. Jacob, I would recommend, if you don't have enough skin for device, use T-tape. I did do T-taping for a while, and I thought it was very effective. There's definitely a downside to it, but it definitely works. If you're not, if you have the ability to do it, and you're not constantly having to rip it off every time you want to hook up or whatever, T-taping really works, and it will work with a lot less skin. And there are some things about T-taping that are really superior in my view. I did it at work for a long time. It's a little bit more involved, but it's less involved than manual methods. So I don't know if it's still around. there's a big thing. A lot of people would post videos on like porn sites on how to do restoration, and then the porn sites took them all down because they were like, oh, it's got to be real porn. So I don't know if I can still find this. Let me look. See if I can find this. 1 second. But T-taping, if you don't have enough skin for a device, T-taping is a really good option. It's a little bit more involved. You have to spend some time, spend more money on tape, but like it is very practically effective. Boop, 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 boop. Let me see if I can find this for you guys. Oh my God. Is it going to be here? Is it going to be here? Oh, this site is so old. Fuck. It's not there anymore. Sorry. Yeah, there was a fucking how-to video on how to do it. I'm sorry that I can't. Yeah, it's gone now. Like I was worried about. Cannot even wear a Band-Aid. Experiment with different adhesives. I had to experiment with tapes. Give a textbook meaning of phimosis for your listeners. Doesn't that mean too much foreskin? No, Kyle Dog. What phimosis means is that the opening of the foreskin is either sufficiently small or sufficiently inelastic, and it could be one or the other, that it can't be retracted back behind your head. So some guys, and the estimates I've seen is they think it's about 2% of intact adults. So it's not 2% of American adults because 75% of American adults are circumcised, so this wouldn't be an issue with them. But you get a situation where your foreskin covers your head, but you can't, quote unquote, pull the skin back. Maybe you can pull it down a little bit. So some guys can pull it and expose maybe the tip of their head or maybe half their head, but they can't get it past. And almost everyone, unless there's something really unusual, anthropometry, the base of your head is going to be wider than the tip of your head. And so what will typically happen is you can't retract it. And some guys, they can't retract it like at all. I have a good friend who's actually, ironically enough, Jewish, who has true phimosis. He's in his 30s. He can't retract his head at all. He's never seen his head. For all he knows, it's purple or blue or red. Like he's just never seen it. And that's phimosis. Paraphimosis means that you can fully retract it behind the head, but then it becomes so tight that it can't get back over the head, over the ridge at the base. And sometimes that can be fixed by getting soft, but it can be really annoying. So those are what phimosis and paraphimosis is. First can cover your head. Oh, your lower head. Lol. Jacob, you might also try things like the PUD, the PUD. I forget what that stands for, but if you just type like PUD, foreskin restoration device, that might be something that works better for you. There's a ton of devices, and if you're at C3, you're getting to the point where like you should be able to use a lot of devices. If you haven't tried them in a while, you might consider retrying some of them. Hygiene is an issue with phimosis. It can be. Sometimes more with other guys. Like I've talked to guys who had phimosis and they felt like they were getting infections. I've also talked to guys who have phimosis who've never had infections. Why are you apologizing to everyone, Kylie Dog? Is it Kylie Dog? Yes. For guys over 28 years of age and under 27, and I'm a RN in HCMC in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Well, I wonder why in Minnesota, because that's interesting. So younger guys in Minnesota are more likely to be uncut. So I have not a friend, an acquaintance. He's from New Hampshire originally, but like he's the third of four brothers, and the first two brothers are cut, and his younger brother is cut, but he's uncut, and he has no idea why. So it's fascinating how some families do that. So BF, you just came on here to talk pro-circumcision talking points, right? We're just going to go through all the litany of every pro-circumcision talking point, right? Come on. I'm glad restoration is working for you, though. It gets depressing in some of the subreddits. Yeah, so I have a TLC tugger. Try a DTR, Jacob. The first device I tried to use was the TLC tugger, and it didn't really work. And I tried a DTR, and it worked really well. So try a DTR. You know, if you're serious about restoration, you know, these devices aren't that expensive. They're usually one-time purchases. Age stats. I've heard good things about the cat, but I've never tried it. But all right, guys, this is getting into a restoration debate, which is great. I mean, I love restoration and all that, but it is getting late here. But let me do the link one more time to the story. Everyone copy this down and, you know, spam all the pro-circumcision people you know. Save it for whenever you have a debate about someone and they bring up the Africa studies. This is absolutely the perfect thing to reply to those Africa studies with. Massive study. It's from Canada. Boom. No, look, I can debate all those points, right? So like the UTI studies are old and they were given bad advice. So the doctors told the mothers, if your son is uncircumcised, these are mothers of like toddlers and babies, that if they're uncircumcised, they need to, quote, forcibly retract the foreskin to clean it. But that is bad medical advice to a baby. They're fused, and so when you pull it back, it causes abrasions and lacerations, which make infection much more likely. So they were giving them advice. I don't think they were doing it intentionally. They just didn't know that was more likely to cause a UTI. UTIs are also treatable by lots of means other than circumcision, and girls get UTIs a lot more than boys, and nobody would say that you should circumcise girls to prevent UTIs in girls. Penis cancer, again, also a very old stat, and there were compounding variables because at the time, richer people were circumcised and poor people were not. The studies were done in England. Circumcision, penis cancer is extremely rare. It only happens in old age. The cervical cancer for women, you don't mutilate somebody else. You don't do a procedure on one person in order to try and help another person, right? Compounding studies there. And so, boom, we can go all day. The HIV is the biggest study, and that's what this video is about. So that's what we're going to focus on. Not everything, but we can talk about everything. I've talked about everything. You want to be a troll, go back and make comments on all my other videos about all the other versions of it, because they're all there. Is Forgin legit? I think Forgin wants to do it, but they're so underfunded that they're making almost no progress. Like if you started restoring your foreskin when you first heard about Forgin when it first came out, you'd be done by now. Yeah, look up a DTR, dual tension device. It would be great if Forgin came through, but they're just so underfunded that they're just not making any. Night Ron, nice seeing you. Thanks, Kylie. My mother always said, pull your skin back. Yeah, that's a super common thing, Kylie Dog. I don't know if you remember a time when you couldn't retract, but I've talked to guys. I talked to a guy in the UK, actually, he's uncircumcised, right? And I I posted about foreskin restoration or something, and this guy messaged me, personal message on Facebook, and he's like, "Hey, I want to talk about that." And I'm like, "What? Okay, tell me what's up." And he's told me that when he was 5, his mom came and put him in the bathtub and said, I need to pull your foreskin back because the doctor said so. And she forcibly retracted his foreskin when he was 5, and it was still fused to the glands, so it ripped. And he said it was the most. I met him when he was older, when he was like in his maybe 21 or 22, and he said it was the most excruciating pain that he's ever experienced. He's never felt pain like that. It was so bad that when I knew him, he was a total bottom. Not everyone can pull their skin back. That's absolutely right. And so that's really bad advice for a doctor doing a study on UTIs to tell the mothers of uncircumcised parents to forcibly retract. Kylie Dog, you must not be watching my videos for the foreskin stuff because you already have your foreskin. You don't have a dog in that fight. You're already uncut. There's a lot of uncut guys in Washington State. It's not just Minnesota, though. It's all over, I found. It's highly regionally specific. So, here in New Hampshire, it's not that common, even among younger guys. There are some, it's a little bit more common, but it's like the 20 and unders, and it's not that common. Maine, it's real common. Uncircumcised guys are very, very common in Maine. Same in Vermont. Same in certain communities in like urban centers. So if you've got Latino people, if you've got European immigrants, Russians, Poles, things like that. There's a lot of Polish people in Poland, right? A lot of Polish people like Boston or New York or Russians or Ukrainians. And then some states have taken it off of Medicare and Medicaid, so it's not covered by the state. And if the state's not subsidizing, it doesn't happen as much. And so that happened years ago in places like California, Oregon, and Washington. And so in those states, the rates now are pretty low. I've heard that they're something like a third, maybe less in some of them, 50%, 30%, which is huge, right? I had a friend who played on a football team in Bangor, Maine, in high school, and he said 2/3 of the guys on the team were uncut, and he was, I think he was 27. And the uncut guys made fun of the cut guys for, having less dick, I guess. And what's the joke? Why is there circumcision so popular in Judaism? Because Jewish women won't buy anything that's not 15% off. Have you ever done a video on uncut guys that fetishize circumcision? No, I've never done a video on that, but that is a thing. Your other things that you have ruminated about over the years have entertained me. What other things? LinkedIn has personally verified uncut men in various states. I have. I've taken extremely scientific anecdotal surveys in every state of the union. I've been to all 48 states in the lower 48. Every one. Yes. Mm-hmm. It's actually, the actual stats on these are really bad. There isn't a systematized way that this is actually checked. So, it's not actually that easy to get concrete numbers on it. I think that, fascinatingly, there's probably a lot of uncircumcised guys out there who are certain that they're the only ones, and that they're very self-conscious about it. Like they're terrified that they're the only uncut guy, when like 20 or 30 or 50% of the guys in their high school are also uncut, and they're all walking around terrified that they're the only one. But since they don't take communal showers anymore, nobody knows. Have you done a video yet on men wanting to increase the size of their thickness? No. That's never been an issue for me, so I've never made a video on it. All right, guys. 2 hours and 9 minutes. Plenty time. Sorry if I didn't get to your comments. Thanks to everyone. Thanks to BF for all the great trolling questions. And yes, it is bastardized Icelandic. All right, guys. Thank you all for watching, and have a great night. Peace. Oh, and don't circumcise your kids.